when you hear from Steve today, you will begin to understand that San Francisco is way ahead of many communities in the East and the Gulf Coast. Steve has a storied background. He's worked for staff in both houses of Congress, in the Senate and the House. He served as Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary for former Governor of California, Pete Wilson. He served as Director of the California Department of Conservation. And he's also worked in the private sector. He was responsible for a $20 million a year grant program for Pacific Gas and Electric. So I'm sure, Steve, we're going to get them in as a founding supporter and sponsor of Nichi. But now he serves as the San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission Chief Deputy Director. Steve is an example of the high-powered and brilliant leadership we're getting around the country. And without any further ado, Steve. Steve, go. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here to join you today. And Bill is my new best friend. And thanks for helping us get out here. I'm not here on my officially because the state of California is still recovering from the economic downturn, and we have restrictions on out-of-state travel. And the other thing I want to say is that it was a great intro, but most of those things are what my boss, Larry Goldsban, has done. I'm just the chief deputy, but what I'm going to do now is walk you through what we're doing here in San Francisco Bay to address the challenge that we face. But I'm going to start by getting a little bit of history on the San Francisco Bay region. I'll try to talk fast because some of these themes have already been covered, and you'll see some similar themes emerging. And I also realize that lunch is waiting. So here we have the San Francisco Bay, the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas, and it is about a third smaller now than it was at the time of the gold rush, when Yerba Buena Cove was a sleepy little village, and when all the ships came in to bring the gold miners, they regaled the sailors about the riches to be found, and all these ships were abandoned there in the bay. The first brig and the first saloon were established there for obvious reasons. And after a while, that all got filled in and is now the financial district of downtown San Francisco. And that filling accelerated as our tools got better. This was filling in for the World's Fair in the 1930s. And each county started filling more and more land and started trying to leapfrog each other until this report came out by the Corps of Engineers at the end of the 50s that showed what would happen if the filling took its natural course and would have turned San Francisco Bay into the San Francisco River. And it was seen as kind of an economic inevitability that this had to happen. But the people of the region realized that that wasn't the San Francisco Bay they wanted to live around. And they formed the Save San Francisco Bay movement to try to control the filling and to try to get more access to the shoreline, which established the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission to restrict filling to the filling that needed to be in the bay. It was a big political battle, and it was a big test. But since then, when it was established in 1965 to today, economic doom hasn't happened to the San Francisco Bay region. As far as I can tell, we've approved billions of dollars of productive investments. We're actually going large-scale restoration of the bay to bring back habitat. And we now have over hundreds of acres of public access along the shoreline, where when the PCDC was established, there was only about 4 miles. So you can say this is a win-win for San Francisco Bay. But of course, now there's the reason why I'm before you here today, is the new threat from sea level rise. BCDC was established to stop the bay from shrinking. And now we're looking at an expanding San Francisco Bay, and what does that mean? And we didn't really understand that, though back in the 90s, actually, based upon an EPA study of sea level rise, we looked at it. But back then, it was just so difficult to know what was going to happen that we really didn't do much. But we looked again just a couple of years ago and did a vulnerability assessment of San Francisco Bay. And this is actually history. This is the last 100 years at the oldest operating tide gauge in the United States at Fort Point by the Golden Gate. Shows around 8 inches of sea level rise at San Francisco Bay. So we did a vulnerability assessment. You heard about that earlier today, where you'll look at the system and what could happen to it. And of course, we don't really know how much greenhouse gas we're going to emit, though we're emitting off the top of those various charts you saw earlier today. But we did an estimate of 16 inches at 50 years and 55 inches at 100 years, the so-called Ramstorff numbers. And the U.S. Geological Survey did the mapping and the analysis of us as what that might do to San Francisco Bay. And this is what we found. That blue there is the areas potentially at risk at 55 inches of sea level rise over around 130 square miles of shoreline. What does that mean? Well, a lot of major infrastructure. I flew out of this airport, SFO. Maybe some of you have as well. And the mapping showed that that's at risk. The light blue shows that it's not only going to be at risk at the end of the century, it's going to be flooded mid-century if it isn't protected. Not only large infrastructure, it's kind of hard to see on the edges of that, but that's people's houses potentially at risk. We found that 250,000 of the Bay Area's residents are potentially at risk of flooding at 55 inches of sea level. And then we have our own economic engines. This is the Silicon Valley, and a lot of the corporate headquarters of the internet giants, like Oracle Corporation, just won the World Cup, and Google are right there and in the inundation area. So what happens if you tried to Google something, they said, sorry, we're underwater. Get back to you on that. So the Pacific Institute took this analysis and looked at the economic costs and found over $60 billion of things at risk to potential flooding. And that didn't have anything except just the simple cost to replace those things. None of the time lost, none of those multiplication factors. So there is a lot at risk in San Francisco Bay. And lastly, the same doom and gloom you heard earlier today, we found that the flooding isn't out at the end of century as these put on top of the storms. And to show that, we overlaid the map of the 50-year mid-century on top of today's 100-year floodplain and found basically they're the same map. So as you heard earlier today, today's flood is tomorrow's high tide. So what we did is prepared amendments to the plans and policies that we use to prepare analysis of people's permits and what their requirements are, and proposed to change them in the face of this new threat of a rising bay. And we found a lot of opposition to this. And this opposition wasn't just from the folks who say, oh, sea level rise isn't real, it's a UN plot or what have you. It was actually a lot of the local governments around the region were very concerned because they thought that we might come in and start telling them what they needed to do. And when I go around and talk in various parts of the country, people say, well, we're a home rule state. Well, I haven't been to a state that isn't a home rule state, and planning and zoning is all local, and folks don't want to lose that control. Also, a lot of the folks who have shoreline properties were afraid of what the economic impacts to the valuation of their property. So it was very controversial. We had a 3-year process, multiple public hearings, because we realized what we had done is we had educated ourselves, but we'd gotten out in front of the public, and we needed to educate them. So after all this time in these public hearings, our commission unanimously voted, and we have 27 members, to adopt the new policies, and they were supported by the environmental community and the business community and by local governments. So what do these policies require? They require that if you have a major project in San Francisco Bay, you have to do a vulnerability assessment like we did for the region to look at what the potential impacts of sea level rise are on your project. So then what? So what we require folks to do is to build to be resilient to mid-century and to plan to be resilient to the end of century. Now, why is that? Well, we really looked at it, and this should work here. We realized that there's actually 2 sea level rises we have to plan for. Out to mid-century, it's relatively flat. It's fairly easy to deal with some of these issues, but then when things take off, it goes crazy, and a lot of those things that worked well turn into maladaptation and will fail terribly. But on the other hand, we don't really know what sea level rise is going to be out there because we have to see how much greenhouse gas is going to be released. So it doesn't really make sense to make people build things when it's going to happen out on the curve and we're not sure what it is. So what we said is build to mid-century and have a plan in place with the financials behind it to be able to be resilient to the end of century. But we also realized that we're a reactive agency. I mean, we adopted these policies, but people come in to get for permits for new projects. That's not going to make the region resilient to sea level rise. So what we need is a regional strategy to address this, because you can't have one locality do the right thing and do the planning and become resilient, and then they fled from the back because their neighbors didn't. So we need a regional strategy to address this. Our policies call for that. But remember, we found how controversial it was when BCDC tried to move out on its own to adopt this. So what we did is we don't have a New York City or a Boston City that is basically kind of ruling the roost and can say, here's what we're going to do. We have 100 local governments in the region. So what we did is we went to our Council of Local Governments, and that isn't how we spell on the West Coast, that's a typo up there. But we went to our Council of Local Governments, ABAG. We got together our Metropolitan Transportation Commission that has a lot of the funding for the projects on the shoreline that are going to get flooded, and also the Air Quality District that's managing the greenhouse gases that are being released, and with us to try to come up with a regional strategy. And at first, they thought that we were just trying to flip our problem to them, but we convinced them that we had to work together as a region, and that links arms with, for example, the local government's work on being resilient to earthquakes in the region. So we are now working together on a regional sea level rise strategy. But what does that mean? I don't think most of us really even know, maybe the gentleman from Louisiana does, what is a real strategy. And I usually find that people have a fight or flight mentality. We're either going to build big levees, we're going to build a barrier at the Golden Gate, and we're going to stop this thing in its tracks and just go on living like we have, or it's going to be flight. We're going to get the heck out of Dodge, just let the water come in and get out of the way. And really, when you think about it, as we heard earlier from Julie, that isn't really the right solution. But we don't really know. This is actually people living their lives in Venice, Italy, and they're living with water literally on a daily basis. This is a building in Hamburg, Germany, that's been built to be resilient to storm surge. So we started thinking about this. How do you really get a regional strategy? So we did what you do when you don't know what to do. We had an international design competition called Rising Tides, which you can go online and look at. We got over 130 ideas from around the world on how do you really start to live with water? How do you adapt to rising tides? How do you adapt the built environment to a rising bay? We also got together and did some hard science, or are doing some hard science, with U.S. Geological Survey and other folks looking at wetlands. You heard from Garth about the value of wetlands because they can attenuate those storm surges so you don't have to build the levees as high. So we looked at one of our local wetlands, and that's at risk. You can see just at mid-century with a wetland in front of it. And we did some hard science. I'm not going to go into the details, but we actually looked at the amount of attenuation the waves were providing, the wetlands were providing from the waves. And we also looked at the wetland itself and how it's being fed by its watershed and how it could persist in the face of sea level rise itself. And lastly, what kind of adaptation measures could we work with the wetlands so that we can help the wetland to persist while also protecting the built environment behind it. We also are looking at the head of tide. This is where salt water meets sweet water coming down from the tributaries. That's where all our communities were originally established. And that's where a lot of our built environment is. And if you do a bathtub model, you don't realize that that water is going to come right up to the heads of tide. That's where a lot of the flooding is going to happen. But then what we realized is this idea that you can't come in and tell the local folks what to do, and you have to work with them. And so what we decided to do was a pilot project for what a regional strategy needs to be, working with the local citizens. So we put together a pilot project in the East Bay, working with the local folks there, and we picked an area that had a lot of natural environment, a lot of built environment, a major seaport, and started to try to do cooperative planning. Got a lot of partners. And we heard at the beginning of the day that we have to figure out how to come up to scale. But one of the things that we really have to struggle with is what is the appropriate scale for adaptation planning and resilience planning? It's important to the local folks. You heard that from Garrett, that what you decide is valuable may not be what's valuable to them. And if you come up with a plan for them, they may not be happy with you when you give it to them. So you've got to work with the local folks, but you also have to work at a regional scale and a state and a federal scale as well. So we got together all those partners and are trying to work and try to see what you need to do and what's the appropriate scale for what aspect of your planning. Did much more detailed and fine-grained flood mapping. And the whole idea is to try to figure out and test drive what works in terms of how you actually do adaptation planning on a regional scale. What really is the right way to go at it? I'm not going to go into the details, but we decided that what you really have to address is the economy. You have to make sure that coming out of this, the economy is going to be more resilient. You have to look at the environment. They have to work together, just like we've talked about earlier. You have to look at the social equity aspects. So there's a lot of underserved and minority communities that are in areas at risk. And you also have to look at governance, because a lot of the models that we've used in the past don't seem to work well when you're trying to address this topic. And I won't go into the details, but we started to come out with some interesting results. The Seaport told us that they didn't have to worry, that they're resilient to sea level rise. Thank you very much. And then we looked at their rail connections and found, just like you guys found in Sandy, that that's fine, they could still be there, but they couldn't get any goods in and out of their port. So that shows you that we have to be working at a regional scale. We've also been working at the state level with the governor's work on a state adaptation strategy across all sectors, because you can't just work at the local level, you have to work across the entire state. And I know you'll begin hearing from the Dutch in the afternoon. We've also been working with the Dutch as a part of the Delta Alliance, comparing and contrasting how they've approached dealing with living with water, comparing it to how we do. And as they probably will tell you, there's much different social roles in our different countries and different approaches of how you deal with these things that we're going to have to start looking at in terms of our governance models of how we address this. It's a hard issue to wrap your arms around. You just can't go out and build the levees of the wetlands. It's going to take a lot of thought and time, and it's going to cost some real money to come up with regional adaptation strategies that work. And we found that it's very expensive just to do this planning, but the cost of implementation is something that is going to be much more expensive. And that's why it's so important that you're bringing this group together to start this conversation, because what we've found is that if you bring everyone together in our Adapting to Rising Tides project, everyone wants to work on this. The controversy went away. Everybody said, yeah, let's do this. But everybody said, but we don't have the funding to implement it. So that's what we need to start coming together with, is figuring out, wrapping our arms, what is adaptation to a rising bay, a rising shoreline, and how do we implement it in a way that furthers our economic prosperity, our social equity, and improves our environment. It's going to be a really daunting challenge, but hearkening back to the beginning of BCDC, folks said that you can't stop the filling of San Francisco Bay. It's an inevitability. And 3 women who perhaps were too naive to know what they were getting into started the movement that was successful. And we think that similarly, we can live with a rising sea. But we all have to get together in a very integrated approach. And I look forward to working with you all on this going forward. And with that,